أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. The author rahimahullah now goes on to mention Babu Salat al-Jum'ati, the section in which he will discuss the rules and applications of the Friday congregational prayer. So the author goes on rahimahullah to say was Salatul Jum'ati fardun ala al-a'yani. The first thing he mentions is that the Salatul Jum'ati is fardun ala al-a'yani, meaning that it is a fard ayn for whoever it is obligatory for them to perform, meaning that it is not a fard kifaya, it is not one of those fards that it is not one of those obligatory acts that if a person were to do it, then it would the obligation would be removed from the rest of the people, but it is an individual obligation, and later on he will mention those conditions which make Jumu'ah obligatory. So for whoever Jumu'ah is obligatory on, then it is they are obligated to perform it. Then he mentions وَلَهَا شُرُوطُ وُجُوبٍ وَأَرْكَانٌ وَآدَابٌ وَأَعْذَارٌ تُبِيحُ التَّخَلُّفَ عَنْهَا. Then he mentions that Jumu'ah consists of shurut wujubin, meaning the conditions that have to be met in order for it to be obligatory. So we will discuss some of the conditions that have to be fulfilled in order for Jumu'ah to be obligatory on a specific individual. Then he says wa arkanun, which are the integrals. In other words, we can say that they're the shurut as-sihha, meaning these are the conditions that have to be met in order for the Jumu'ah to be sound, or in order for the Jumu'ah to be existing. Meaning the essential integrals in order for something to be rightly considered Jumu'ah, then these things have to be mentioned, and he will mention them later on. Wa adabun, and he will tell you about the adabun, generally referring to the way in which it should be carried out, the recommended things that should be done on the day of Jumu'ah for the sake of Jumu'ah. وَأَعْذَارٌ تُبِيحُ التَّخَلُّفَ عَنْهَا, and also the valid excuses in which it is permissible for a person not to attend Jumu'ah if Jumu'ah is obligatory. So in the case when Jumu'ah is obligatory on somebody, there are some cases in which it is permissible for them not to attend, and he will mention them. So the first category that he's going to cover is فَأَمَّا شُرُوطُ وُجُوبِهَا فَسَبْعَةٌ. As for the شُرُوطُ وُجُوبِهَا, they are 7. The first one he mentions is al-Islamu. So in order for it to be obligatory on a person, they obviously have to be a Muslim. وَالْبُلُوغُ, reaching the age of puberty. So once a person reaches the age of puberty, then these are one of the conditions of shurut wujub, which wal-bulugh would rule out the person obviously who has not reached the age of puberty, like a child. Wal-aqlu, meaning that a person has a sound intelligence, that they can hear and they can understand, and that they don't have any mental deficiencies. Otherwise, Jumu'ah is not obligatory on them. Wal-dhukuriyatu, and to be a male is another condition, which means that it's not obligatory for women to attend the Jumu'ah prayer. Wal-hurriyatu, meaning that a person is not a slave. In other words, if a person was a slave, then Jumu'ah would not be obligatory on them. Wal-iqamatu means that a person is muqim fil balad, meaning that he is a resident, which is contrary to a traveler. A person who is traveling through a town in which he is a traveler and Jumu'ah occurs, Jumu'ah is not obligatory on him. Was-sihhatu, also to be healthy, not sick. So a person who is sick, to the point that it would be very difficult for him to attend Jumu'ah, like maybe a person who has a very serious fever in the middle of the winter, or a person who has some type of sickness that has caused him to be bedridden, then in that case, Jumu'ah would not be obligatory. So any one of these conditions, in order for the Jumu'ah to be obligatory, all of these conditions have to be there. If one of these conditions are missing, then Jumu'ah wouldn't be obligatory. So for example, a Muslim who would reach the age of puberty, who had a sound intelligence, who was not a slave, who was a resident, and who was sound, but it's a female. Then in this case, Jumu'ah is not obligatory because one of the conditions is missing. Then he goes on, he says, وَأَمَّا أَرْكَانُهَا فَخَمْسَةٌ. The integrals of Jumu'ah, he says, الْأَوَّلُ الْمَسْجِدُ الَّذِي يَكُونُ جَامِعًا. The first thing, in order for Jumu'ah to be considered sound, is that it has to be prayed in a masjid. And what do you mean by it has to be prayed inside of a masjid? It has to be prayed inside of a masjid that is built as a masjid, not a masjid that's in a convenience store, that is part of a convenience store plaza, or a masjid that is under a building. Most people call these masjids, but technically speaking, they're only called musallas, places where you pray. Al-masjid has to be something that is built specifically as a masjid. And generally, that if a person were to look at it, a person would say that's a masjid, meaning it was built for the 5 daily prayers. So according to the Maliki, you have to pray in a built masjid, not a masjid under an apartment building or in a plaza or anything like that. It has to be a specifically built masjid. So that also answered the question. For example, some of the people performing their Jumu'ahs inside of MSAs, inside of universities, and so on and so forth, according to the Malikiya, a person would not be fulfilling the obligation of their Jumu'ah if they were to perform it according to the Maliki school. Athani, the second integral is al-Jama'atu, meaning that Jumu'ah has to be prayed in congregation. And he says, وَلَيْسَ لَهُمْ حَدٌّ عِنْدَ مَالِكٍ بَلْ لَا بُدَّ أَن تَكُونَ جَمَاعَةً تَتَقَرَّى بِهِمْ قَرْيَةٌ وَرَجَّحَ بَعْضُ أَئِمَّتِنَا أَنَّهَا تَجُوزُ بِإِثْنَيْ عَشَرَ رَجُلًا بَاقِينَ لِسَلَامِهَا. There's 2 important issues which the author unfortunately doesn't distinguish between. There's 2 issues. The first issue that he's talking about is the establishing the Jumu'ah for the first time in a specific place. For example, in some places where they are building or extending a city, or a place where the Muslims are going to the outskirts to build a community and they want to establish a masjid. When and how does Jumu'ah become obligatory in a place where they begin to inhabit? So he says, وَلَيْسَ لَهُمْ حَدٌّ عِنْدَ مَالِكٍ. So if we want to start Jumu'ah in a place, if we build a masjid, there's no specific number that has to be met in order for us to say that Jumu'ah is obligatory. So for example, we're not going to say there has to be 30 families or 40 families or 50 families living in this area in order for it to be, in order for Jumu'ah to be considered established or obligatory. But what we're going to say is, as long as there's enough people, jama'atan tataqarrar bihim qaryatun, enough people in that area in which it can be said that those people have started a community, in the sense that they are totally sufficient, meaning that they get their food from that place, they get their water from that place, meaning that they're able to survive individually. The reason why they're stipulating these conditions is in order for this place to be called a town, it has to be self-sufficient. So meaning it's got its own stores, it's got its own places, meaning they're now not in need of going to the next town in order to get things. So specifically speaking, or to be a bit more realistic, if we were to establish a masjid somewhere on the outskirts of the city to start our own community, and we established the masjid, a very simple masjid that we can pray Jumu'ah in, but we don't have our own markets yet. We don't have our own water system. We don't have our own means to supply our own safety. Basically meaning that we are depending upon the neighboring towns for our sustenance. Then in this case, Jumu'ah will not be established until these things are fulfilled. So that's why he mentions jama'atan tataqarrar bihim qaryatun. It has to be a congregation of people. It has to be an amount of people living in this place so that we can technically call it a town. So that condition, it has to be there in order for the first Jumu'ah only. So for example, what we're all of what we've been talking about now is establishing Jumu'ah for the first time in a new location. And then he says, وَرَجَّحَ بَعْدُ أَئِمَّتِنَا أَنَّهَا تَجُوزُ بِإِثْنَيْ عَشَرَ رَجُلًا بَاقِينَ لِسَّلَامِهَا. The mas'ala that he's talking about here now is the every other Jumu'ah after the first Jumu'ah. In this case, in order for Jumu'ah to be sound, meaning that we to be considered that we prayed the Jumu'ah in Jama'ah, there has to be at least 12 people, not including the Imam, after the Salam of the Imam. So meaning, let's say we go to Jumu'ah and only 10 people show up, and the Imams, and they pray the Jumu'ah for whatever sake, and they say Assalamu alaikum, there's only 10 people following the Imam, then the Jumu'ah would not be considered sound. There has to be 12 people behind the Imam from the beginning to the end, and that's why it says بِإِثْنَيْ عَشَرَ رَجُلًا بَاقِينَ لِسَّلَامِهَا, which also means that, for example, if let's say we establish the city and for whatever reason Thursday night half of the town decided to get up and leave. So when Jumu'ah came around, before Jumu'ah, we seen that once Jumu'ah started, there was only 7 people who attended the Jumu'ah. And what we mean by the people attending the Jumu'ah, we mean the people who it's obligatory for them to attend Jumu'ah. So we're not including women, and we're not including children. So 7 men to whom Jumu'ah is obligatory on are the only ones left remaining in this place. Then, in this case, Jumu'ah wouldn't be considered obligatory anymore because they don't have 12 people to fulfill the condition. Another view or another way of looking at this too is, let's just say that we were doing Jumu'ah and there was 15 people, but during the Jumu'ah 4 of them broke their wudu, and so they went to go make wudu, and the Imam said salam, and there was only 11 people left. Then in this case, Jumu'ah would have to be repeated because there has to be 12 people baqina lis-salamiha that have to be there until the salam has been fulfilled. Until the salam has occurred, meaning the salam of the Jumu'ah, meaning the exit or the finishing of the prayer of the Jumu'ah. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sound. Al-Thalithu, the third condition, the third integral is al-khutbatul ula, وهي ركن على الصحيح, وكذلك الخطبة الثانية على المشهور. Yani that there has to be 2 khutbahs. Part of the integrals of Jumu'ah is that it has to consist of the 2 khutbahs. So let's say, for example, if and what we mean by khutbahs is we mean Arabic khutbahs. It has to be done in Arabic language. It can't be done in any other language. So for example, if a khutbah was done in English and then they stood up and they prayed the Jumu'ah prayer, then the Jumu'ah prayer wouldn't be sound, because the khutbah, the first khutbah and the second khutbah have to be there, and they have to be done in English language. So the best way to do the Jumu'ah in our times is to have a person stand up beforehand and speak in English as he pleases. Then to actually start the Jumu'ah after by having the 2 recitations of the khutbah in Arabic and then the Jumu'ah prayer right after. But they should not just, it wouldn't be sound if a person was just to speak in English and then pray the Salatul Jumu'ah. It would not be considered valid. So again, the best way of doing it is to give a speech at the beginning in English if a person wishes, then to do the 2 khutbahs, and then to say the Jumu'ah prayer. So that's why he says وَكَذَلِكَ الْخُطْبَةُ الْخُطْبَةُ الْأُولَى وَهِيَ رُكْنٌ, it's a rukn على الصحيح according to the sound opinion. وَكَذَلِكَ الْخُطْبَةُ الثَّانِيَةُ على المشهور. So in reality, both of the khutbahs are considered integrals. Then he says وَلَا بُدَّ أَن تَكُونَ بَعْدَ الزَّوَالِ وَقَبْلَ الصَّلَاةِ, and it is necessary, it is a condition that both of the khutbahs happen after the zawal, meaning after the dukhul al-dhuhr. You cannot start the khutbahs before dhuhr time comes in, because dhuhr is a substitute for, Jummah is a substitute for dhuhr, and so so the Jummah, all of Jummah has to occur in its time. Because some of the scholars are of the opinion that the reason why we pray 2 rak'ahs is because the 2 khutbahs are replacements for the rak'ahs. Although that's some of the opinion of the scholars, sometimes it's there's some point of views that can make this issue problematic. But in general, the point that he's making here is that it has to be done after the time that dhuhr has come in. That's why it says ba'd al-zawali wa qabla al-salati, and the khutbahs have to be done before the prayer. Then he says وَلَيْسَ فِي الْخُطْبَةِ حَدٌّ عِنْدَ مَالِكٍ أَيْضًا وَلَا بُدَّ أَن تَكُونَ مِمَّا تُسَمِّيهِ الْعَرَبُ خُطْبَةً. Then here he mentions that, which is an answer to a question: how long does the khutbah have to be in order for it to be considered a khutbah? Does it have to consist of 1 ayah, or 2 ayahs, or 3 ayahs, or so on and so forth? He says here that وَلَا بُدَّ أَن تَكُونَ مِمَّا تُسَمِّيهِ الْعَرَبُ. Yani Imam Malik once again did not make any specific limitation or specific criteria to what exactly a khutbah has to be, but he just says, all he said is that it has to be that in which the Arabs consider a khutbah. According to the Arabic language, what would be considered a khutbah? So in general, the khutbah it should consist of mentioning the name of Allah, mentioning the sending salawat on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, warning people to obey Allah and to stay away from sin, and recitation of an ayah from the Quran. So that's why it says, if we look at Sheikh Dardir, he gives us a short thing in which we can actually consider it, as long as these things are there, we can actually consider it a khutbah. So he mentions that if we were to say Alhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, wa amma ba'du usikum bi taqwallah wa ta'atihi wa uhadhirukum an ma'asiyatihi wa mukhalifatihi, qala Allahu ta'ala فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى. So if a person was just to read that in both of the khutbahs, meaning read that in the first khutbah, read that in the second khutbah, that technically speaking would be considered a khutbah according to the Arabs, and that would be sufficient for Jumu'ah. So a person could give their bayan in English, and then after that, then they could do these 2 khutbahs in Arabic, and that would be considered sufficient. And then he mentioned was tustahabbu taharatu fihima. It is recommended for the person who's giving the khutbah to be in the state of purification for both of them, but it is not an integral, but it is considered mustahab. Then he says, وَفِي وُجُوبِ الْقِيَامِ لَهُمَا تَرَدُّدٌ. The later scholars differed on whether or not it is obligatory for the person who is giving the khutbah, whether he has to stand or not. Is it obligatory or not? The later scholars differed whether or not that's obligatory or not. And so it is better to err on the side of the caution and to stand for the khutbah. But obviously, if a person who is sick, then sitting down shouldn't affect the khutbah. But we should always avoid the khilaf by taking the opinion in which there is no doubt, and that would be to stand for the khutbah. وَالرَّابِعُ الْإِمَامُ. The fourth one is that there has to be an imam. وَمِن صِفَتِهِ أَن يكون مما تجب عليه الجمعة. Yani that the congregation, or that the that the Jummah prayer has to be led by an imam, meaning that it cannot be prayed individually. وَمِن صِفَتِهِ, and from the necessary conditions of that imam, and يكون ممن تجب عليه الجمعة, it has to be from somebody who Jummah is obligatory on. This is a very important point which rules out the musafir, the traveler. So for example, it's very common that travelers come into town to different masjids and give khutbahs. According to the Maliki school, the prayer of the traveler who came for Jummah would not be considered sound. So if a speaker came from the US to Canada and led the Jummah prayer, according to the Malikis, it wouldn't be considered sound, because one of the conditions of the imam is that he has to be muqim. He cannot be a musafir. He cannot be a traveler, because a person who's traveling, then Jummah is not obligatory on him. أن يكون ممن تجب عليه الجمعة احترازا. And he mentions this condition. And he mentions this condition as, the fact that a person has to be, that Jummah has to be obligatory on him, it automatically rules out the child, meaning the person who has not reached the age of puberty, or musafir, and obviously a woman. So that's why it says ihtirazan min as-sabi, yani contrary to the sabi wal musafir and the traveler, wa ghayrihima mimman lam tajibu alayhim, and anybody else who is not who Jummah is not obligatory on, then if they were to pray as an imam, then the Jummah would not be considered sound. وَيُشْتَرَطُ أَنْ يَكُونَ الْمُصَلِّي بِالْجَمَاعَةِ هُوَ الْخَاطِبُ إِلَّا لِعُذْرٍ يَمْنَعُهُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ مِنْ مَرَضٍ أَوْ جُنُونٍ وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ. It says here also, it is also a necessary condition that the person who is praying bil-jama'ati, meaning the imam who is praying with the jama'ah, هُوَ الْخَاطِبُ إِلَّا لِعُذْرٍ, that he must be the one who is giving the sermon in Arabic. So for example, you can't give one person can't give the khutbah and another person lead the Jummah prayer. Although it is permissible, like we said, if a person's given an English bayan, in reality that has nothing to do with the Jummah. So if you had a person come from out of town, they can give the English bayan, but the local person should read the two khutbahs and lead the prayer. So that's what he says here, هُوَ الْخَاطِبُ إِلَّا لِعُذْرٍ. So the person who is praying should be the same person who's doing the sermons, except if there's an udhr, except if there's a valid excuse, يَمْنَعُهُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ مِنْ مَرَضٍ أَوْ جُنُونٍ. Let's say, for example, the person who gives the khutbahs, but he cannot pray. For example, he cannot make sujood, or he's very sick for one reason or another. There's something that prohibits him from doing the prayer. Then in this case, that can be overlooked and it would be permissible. إِلَّا لِعُذْرٍ يَمْنَعُهُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ مِنْ مَرَضٍ أَوْ جُنُونٍ وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ. Like a person who's sick, or who becomes sick during the khutbah, or something happens to him in which he cannot lead the prayer, then that's okay. Then he says, وَيَجِبُ انْتِظَارُهُ لِلْعُذْرِ الْقَرِيبِ عَلَى الْأَصَحِّ. If there's a udhr that is qareeb, meaning if a person, the ulama separated between an excuse that cannot be fixed and an excuse that can be fixed closely or after a short period of time. For example, let's say the imam has a nosebleed. It's a matter of fact of him going downstairs, cleaning his nose and removing the blood, then coming back up. Then they say in this case it's obligatory for us to wait for the imam to come back. But in the case where it's not qareeb, where it's ba'id, meaning that it is not assumed that the thing that is prohibited is going to go away anytime within the Jummah period, then in that case it's acceptable for another person to lead the prayer. Al-Khamisu, the fifth one, موضع الاستيطان فلا تقام الجمعة إلا في موضع يستوطن فيه. The fifth condition is that it has to be a mawdi'ul istitana. Here he's referring to that it has to be done within the city boundaries. So the Jummah cannot be performed out somewhere, let's say on a campsite. It has to be performed within the city boundaries. That's what he means by موضع الاستطانة فلا تقام الجمعة إلا في موضع يستوطن فيه. And so it is not to be performed in a place where there's no residency. And then he says ويكون محلا الإقامة يمكن مثوى فيه بلد كان أو قرية. Here the author mentions something which he did not need to mention, but he mentioned it anyways. ويكون محلا الإقامة, and that it has to be in a place in a place in which there is residence. But that is, he mentioned this actual thing beforehand. يمكن مثوى فيه بلدا أو كان أو قرية. And I mentioned this point before, that what we mean by in a town place is that they are totally self-sufficient, in that everything that they need, they have their own markets and so on and so forth, to the point that they can actually be called a town. So the author didn't have to mention it. The simple thing he could have just said is إِلَّا فِي مَوْضِعٍ يُسْتَوْطَنُ فِيهِ. Just simply means that it has to be, the Jumu'ah has to be performed within a town and cannot be performed outside of it. And that's the end of the author mentioning the 5 things mentioned about the arkan of Jumu'ah.